I really appreciate you being here. I appreciate us being able to be together to talk about additional difficult moments in the life of our nation. Together as a Central Synagogue community, as we gather tonight, we are thinking of all of the victims at the elementary school in Texas, at Robb Elementary School in Uvalde, Texas. Those who died, those who were injured, and the concentric circles of their friends and families and loved ones that today's horrific incident will continue to affect. We are here together tonight to talk about another challenge in the life of our nation, and also how our Jewish texts can guide us and can perhaps show us other ways of thinking about issues that may be presented to us as if they were black and white. Judaism has so much depth and so much exists within our tradition that will help us navigate these difficult questions in front of us. Our guide tonight, we are honored to have our colleague and our friend, Rabbi Rebecca Rosenthal, speaking to us and teaching us this evening. Rabbi Rosenthal joined Central Synagogue in 2015, and since then she has been the Director of Youth and Family Education, Youth and Family Programs here at Central Synagogue. Rebecca works with kids, she works with adults, she works with every single age. She is a master educator and has been recognized as such with a Wexner Graduate Fellowship and by the youth and families of our congregation every single day. Rabbi Rosenthal, in addition to being a master educator, has a specific interest in halakha, in Jewish law, and what it has to say about the questions that surround abortion. So it is my honor, it is my pleasure to introduce my colleague, my office next door neighbor, Rabbi Rebecca Rosenthal. Thanks for being here.
Thanks so much, Rabbi Berman. It's an honor to be here with all of you. And I will say that one of the reasons I became a rabbi is because I believe that Judaism has something to add to the conversation, not just about things like ritual and prayer, but about the issues of the day. It's something that I always believed. It was part of my Judaism growing up, and it is part of my Judaism now, which is how I got interested in thinking about what does Judaism have to say about this topic of abortion. And as Rabbi Berman says, as we're facing this incredibly difficult and enraging and sad and horrific shooting in Texas, I don't really have any words. I have no words of what to do or how to comfort people in this terrible moment, but our tradition actually provides a guide for how we respond. And one of the ways that we respond in Judaism is by teaching Torah in the names of those who have died and in their memory. And so what we're going to do tonight, although we do not know the names of the victims in Texas, we are going to teach this Torah in their memory in the hopes that the more Torah, the more comfort, the more prayers we can bring into the world, that will help us inch closer to making our world a better place. And there will be a lot of time and a lot of ways for us to reflect on this moment together as a community. And I appreciate that we can be together to teach Torah in the names of these children and their teacher, and may their memories be a blessing, and may they inspire us not only to prayer, but also to action and to revolution and to bringing our world a little closer to redemption. So on that note, one of the ways that we can help get there is to create community among the people who are in this Zoom tonight. So as Rachel has been saying, please introduce yourself in the chat if you have not already. There are too many people on this Zoom for us to truly be able to unmute and have a conversation. So if you want to have a further conversation about this afterwards, send me an email. We can go have a coffee and we can talk about it further. But if you have questions or comments, please put them in the chat. Rachel and Rabbi Berman will be watching the chat. I'm going to try not to let it get too distracting to me as I'm going through, but I will give moments for questions. So please, anytime, please put them in the chat, and and we will do our best to answer them. So the first thing that I will say is a contradictory statement in and of itself, which is there is both consensus and no consensus on what Judaism says about abortion. And here's what I mean by that, which is the canon of Jewish texts is enormous. When people talk about the Talmud or the Mishnah or the codes, even within one book, there are contradictions, and abortion is no exception. You can find texts that support abortion, and you can find texts that forbid it. You can find texts that say abortion in all cases, like for all, in all moments, and you can find texts that say never ever. However, we as Jews do not look at texts in isolation. We do not pluck one text and say, because of this one thing, I know what to do now. We stand on the shoulders of people who came before us. And so one of the most remarkable things actually about the conversation about abortion is how much agreement there has been over really centuries of rabbinic literature around what Judaism has to say about abortion, which is, as a general rule, Judaism believes in abortion. Some people that abortion is permitted. Some people want to put more limits on it than other people. But in general, you will not find a lot of rabbis and people who make rabbinic decisions saying abortion is absolutely forbidden. And one of the things that drives that actually also drives our response, God willing, to this mass shooting in Texas is the idea that in Judaism, life is sacred. All of us, as we learn in Genesis, were created in the image of God, and therefore our lives are sacred and precious. And we never in Judaism value one life over another life. We are not permitted to make a choice about your life or my life, because my life is just as precious as your life, and vice versa. And so when we approach texts about abortion, we ask the question about valuing life, and what does life mean, and what does it mean to value life, and what does it mean also to save a life, to do pikuach nefesh, which is the Hebrew word for saving a life. We have to ask ourselves, whose life are we saving, and how do we figure out what we should do? So on that note, I am going, and maybe I'll have Rachel put the source sheet in the chat one more time, and I'm also going to share a screen so you can follow along. I really want to give, I've always taught to teach your teachings in the name of your teacher, B'Shem Umro, and I want to give a lot of credit here to Rabbi Danya Ruttenberg and the National Council of Jewish Women, who put together many, many of these sources that we are going to be looking at tonight, and who have spent a lot of time on the question of the Jewish tradition's response to abortion. One other thing before I share screen that you will notice, and this is something I almost never do, which is that all the sources on this sheet, with the exception of the last one, come from men. Women's voices are, for various reasons, almost completely absent from the legal debate about abortion. Mostly because women's voices are absent from the debate about everything. But the other piece of that is that once women got involved in the discussions of Jewish law, the questions about abortion had been mostly settled, right? Settled law, that's something we hear a lot about with the Supreme Court, but it's also true in Judaism. And so there has not been a huge need for anyone to come and write a new opinion about whether or not Judaism permits abortion, because unlike almost anything else, there's actually a fair amount of agreement. And when you have, Orthodox, conservative, Reform, and Reconstructionist Jews agreeing on something, like, that's what will bring the Messiah, I think. So you will see that none of our primary sources are sources written by women. And I urge you to come one day and take another class with me, and that will never be true. So I just give you that, I give you that caveat. So I'm going to share my screen, and I'm going to, oh no, that's not working. I was going to try to make it bigger, but it didn't really work. But hopefully you also have the source sheet in front of you if you would like it. So this first text is from Exodus. It is, I would say, kind of it's where everybody starts in the discussion of abortion. So it is from Parshat Mishpatim, right after the Israelites have gotten the Torah, and Mishpatim means laws. God gives them a lot of laws, and this is one of them. When two or more parties fight, and one of them pushes a pregnant woman, and a miscarriage results, right? So there's a fight on the street, and the two parties are not pregnant. It's two fighting parties, and they accidentally push into a pregnant woman, and she has a miscarriage. But no other damage ensues, right? So the only damage is the miscarriage. The one responsible shall be fined according as the woman's husband may exact, the payment to be based on reckoning. So that's Torah speak for the person who caused the miscarriage will pay her husband money, right? So this is a very patriarchal system where women are mostly the property of their husbands, where the fetus is also the property of her husband in this case. So the person who suffers the damages, and I mean damages in a legal sense, is the husband, and the husband is paid money for his loss, for the miscarriage. So we have a situation where a woman has suffered a miscarriage, and the punishment for causing the miscarriage is monetary. This is extremely important in thinking about what is the status of the fetus. Is the fetus a person? When does life begin? Right? These are essential abortion questions, and Judaism answers them in the Torah, right? It doesn't even wait for the Mishnah or the Talmud or anything else. Judaism answers it in our most foundational text, the Torah. Then we get to verse 23 and 24 and 25, which might sound familiar to some of you. But if other damage ensues, the penalty shall be life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, bruise for bruise. So if in this fight, they push the woman and she has a miscarriage, and she also has some kind of damage to her eye, the person who caused damage to her eye is required to pay money for the miscarriage, and he or she has to suffer the same damage to their eye. So here's how this gets understood. This is the beginning of Judaism's discussion of the death penalty. And we could do a whole other class on the death penalty because it's super interesting. But this is the beginning of Judaism's discussion of the death penalty, life for life, right? If you take someone's life, then there is capital punishment according to the Torah. You forfeit your own life. If the fetus were a life, then the punishment for causing a miscarriage would have to be the death penalty. If the fetus were considered a life, then verse 23 has to apply. It has to be life for life. But what verse 22 is telling you is, in fact, a fetus is not a life in the same way as killing someone who is not a fetus, right? The penalty for a miscarriage for causing a fetus's death is monetary, which tells you that, at least according to the book of Exodus, a fetus is not a life. It's not a life in the way that we understand a life, right? A life is a living, breathing human being outside the womb. That's not to say the fetus isn't important. That's not to say the fetus can't be loved, but it does say that the fetus is that the fetus is not a life. So Rachel or Sarah, are there any questions about that have come up? I can't really see the chat.
No questions yet.
Okay, great. So that's the foundation of the discussion of abortion. So it's very important that we understand that, because when we look at the Torah, it tells us that a fetus is not a life. And because the Torah is very sparse in its words, it actually doesn't say anything about sort of how the age of the fetus or how pregnant she is. It's just that she's pregnant. We don't know if this person is, 6 weeks pregnant or 38 weeks pregnant. We don't know anything about that. We just know that if the fetus is inside the womb, it is not considered, the penalty is different than if the baby were born. So the Talmud comes to reinforce this point, which is in the book, in the tractate of Sanhedrin. Sanhedrin is the tractate of the Talmud that deals with capital punishment. If any of you take the Talmud class with my sister, Rachel Rosenthal, I suspect she has taught from this tractate since that was the topic of her dissertation. But this is the tractate that deals with questions of capital punishment. So the Talmud teaches, in cases of capital law, the dispute concerning such a prohibition is with regard, don't worry about the language, is with regard to the issue that is the subject of the dispute between Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi and the rabbis. So they're just giving you the background, right? That Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, who is the Nasi, the head of the community and the compiler of the Mishnah, and the rabbis are having some kind of argument. And it is taught in a Braita, which is a piece of text, that Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi said with regard to that which is written, if two men struggle or if two men fight, this is our Exodus text, and they hurt a pregnant woman, then he doesn't give you the rest of it. And if there shall be a tragedy, you shall give life for life, right? And so what I'm just going to scroll up. Sorry about all the scrolling, right? So they are giving you the first half of verse 22, and then they're going into verse 23. The translation doesn't exactly line up, but the damage or the tragedy, right? Those are the same things. The reference is to a monetary payment for the life that he took, the monetary payment for the miscarriage, and then the tragedy, right? Or the damage, the additional damage is the unintentional killing of the mother. So if these two people are fighting and they hit a pregnant woman and she dies and her fetus dies, there's a double punishment. There's the monetary punishment for the fetus and there's the death penalty for killing the mother. And that's how you know that the fetus and the mother have two different statuses, I think is a word. They have two different statuses because there are two different punishments, one for killing the mother and one for killing the fetus. So that here the rabbis come in the Talmud and they don't try to dispute or disprove or do any kind of mental gymnastics around the question of what is the status of the fetus. Instead, they reinforce what's in the Torah, right? Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi is a very prominent, important rabbi, and he reinforces what's in the Torah and says, actually, the fetus has the status of monetary damages. So we have three more things about the status of the fetus. And this is just to give you a sense of all over the Talmud, they're discussing these questions. By the way, this is always men discussing women's bodies. It's just what they do with their time. So, thinking about also, right, like you could imagine that if you are pregnant and you want to be pregnant and you get in the middle of a fight and you suffer a miscarriage, that would be very traumatic. And they don't deal with that piece of it at all. Right, all of the damages, everything goes to the husband. They do not deal with the emotional state of the pregnant person at all. So then we have this discussion in Yevamot, which is a tractate of the Talmud that deals with all kinds of like marriage and divorce and other things. And they say, and if she is pregnant until 40 days from conception, the fetus is merely water. It is not yet considered a living being, right? So for the first 40 days, it's like, it's not even a thing. It's just kind of fluid, water. And so if something were to happen to the fetus at that point, it's not even like you were pregnant. It's just not even, they don't even consider it to be, it's not even a being, it's just water. And this has some implications for what women are and aren't allowed to do that, again, could be the topic of a whole other class, the purity standards for women. But for the case of this, right, we can see that life does not begin at conception, because 39 days into the fetus's life, they're still considered to be water. And this is, there is basically, there are a few outlier texts, but there is basically no one in the Jewish tradition who believes that life begins at conception. There are discussions of when does God put a soul into the fetus, but it's still, again, they're not really discussing life in the way that we think about it. But this here is, they could not be clearer, I think, and they're usually kind of obtuse. So this is pretty amazing. They could not be clearer that life, that life does not begin at conception. So I brought this fourth one because actually I had never seen it before I started working on this class, but I thought it was, I mean, it's both horrifying and fascinating at the same time. If a pregnant woman, I added the word pregnant because you need it there, is about to be executed, they do not wait until she gives birth, right? So this Mishnah has come to teach us that they can just execute a pregnant woman, but if she's already on the birth stool, meaning she's already in labor, then they wait until she gives birth. So this again reinforces the idea that a fetus is not a life, because if a fetus was a life, they couldn't execute I mean, I don't think, by the way, let me just be clear, I don't think they're going around executing pregnant women. They really, I'll give you a spoiler alert for my one-day future death penalty class, which is that they're really not very big fans of the death penalty. But I think they bring and actually you'll see this later in our text study, they bring these extreme examples, I think, to highlight for us and to say a fetus is not an independent life, right? It is actually part of the mother. So don't go around saying you can't do this and you can't do that because, you know, a fetus is a life. No, even in the case where they're going to execute a pregnant woman, right? The only way they might consider the fetus to be a life is if it's kind of already coming out. But before then, the fetus does not count as its own independent life. It is part of the mother. And I do not think that they were going around executing pregnant women. So we can leave that to the side. So the way, for those of you who have not studied a lot of Talmud, the way the Talmud works is that they have a Mishnah. This is a Mishnah. It's like a saying or a teaching. And then the rabbis come and they discuss it, right? And so they are discussing, they discuss the questions that were raised in the Mishnah, and that's called the Gemara. Isn't it obvious that the court executes the pregnant women rather than waiting? Okay, you and I might not think it's obvious that a court would execute a pregnant woman. But look at their reasoning. It's so amazing. They say, after all, it is her body, right? Meaning, after all, that, right? Every once in a while, the rabbis like drop in something super interesting and progressive, and you're like, whoa, I don't know if they meant that, but I'll take it. And so there's, right, they say, well, of course we would execute a pregnant woman. It's just all part of her body. The fetus is part of her body. It's not its own independent thing. We wouldn't delay our execution for a fetus. So that, you're right, and right, this is a it's a twisted argument, but it is a my body, my choice kind of argument that the rabbis are making somewhat unknowingly. So the Gemara answers, it was necessary for the Mishnah to teach us this. As it might enter your mind to say, or you might think to say, that because of our Exodus text, the fetus is considered to be the property of the husband, right? Because the person, go back to our Exodus text, because the person who caused the miscarriage, because that person had to pay the husband, you might think you shouldn't execute the pregnant woman because you will be damaging her husband's property, right? That's just like, think about that. Think about the way they view husbands and wives to get to that argument. But they really don't want, they don't want to mess with his property, i.e. his fetus. So they might say, like, you might think that fetus is the property of the husband, so you can't execute the woman because it would damage the husband's fetus property. And if so, the court should wait until she gives birth before executing her and not cause the husband to lose the fetus, right? So that would be the counter argument. Let her wait until she gives birth so that the husband doesn't lose his property, and then you can execute her all you want. So the Mishnah comes and teaches us, actually, we don't take that into account. The thing we take into account is that the fetus is part of her body, and so if we want to execute her, we will execute her. All right, I'm going to do one more, and then I'm going to try to take some, I would like there to be a question, because I have been talking for 26 minutes, which is, it may be a record. So this is Ramban, not to be confused with Rambam, who is Maimonides. This is Ramban. Ramban comes and teaches, as far as the observance of mitzvot, of commandments, is concerned, we would violate them for the fetus's sake, right? So the question that he's talking about is whether someone should violate Shabbat to save a fetus, not the pregnant woman, but the fetus, right? And if the fetus is a life, then you must violate Shabbat to save the fetus, right? Because life is the most important thing. But if the fetus is not a life, then the question is a little bit murky, right? So would we violate Shabbat for the fetus's sake? For the Torah says to violate one Shabbat for this fetus, because if he's saved, he'll have the chance, God willing, to observe many more Shabbats, right? So if you can save the fetus, you save it, not because the fetus is a life, but because it is a potential life. That doesn't mean you save it at the expense of the mother. That doesn't mean you don't let the mother have an abortion. It means that if the fetus is in distress and you have to do something that would violate Shabbat in order to save the fetus, you do it, because the fetus, while not a life, is a potential life. Therefore, even for the sake of a fetus that is less than 40 days post-conception, the water thing, that as of yet has no life at all, we would still violate Shabbat in accordance with the opinions of the author of Halachot Gedolot, which means the great laws, right? So basically, if a woman is having a miscarriage, you should try to step in and help her, right? You don't just leave her bleeding on the ground on Shabbat, because you want to help, if she wants you want to help save the life of the fetus. Okay, so I'm gonna stop the share for a minute so I can look at the questions. Ed asks, these tests are very convincing as to the Jewish teaching on the subject. How then do we explain the view of many traditional rabbis in our current times, which seems to be on the Christian side of teaching? And this other question of why Christianity and Judaism are so different on this. So I am not a scholar of Christianity, so I preface this with that. But Christianity believes, at least certain strains of Christianity believe, that life begins at conception. And if you believe that life begins at conception, then abortion is a problem. It clearly, right? Because even a fetus or a zygote, I'm going back to high school biology for that word, is a life. And so if you believe in the value and the sanctity of life, which Christianity does, then you have two lives the entire time that somebody is pregnant. And so you run into a problem. Abortion is a real problem. The question of the views of many traditional rabbis in our current time, many Orthodox rabbis support abortion in particular circumstances. I would say even the most liberal rabbi, people talk about this idea of abortion on demand, which I think is basically a right-wing talking point. I don't think there are a lot of people who just feel like people should just, that there are not a lot of rational people who think that people are deciding to have abortions with no thought. They're just waking up one morning and thinking like, oh, I think I'll have an abortion today. That's not exactly how people work, right? And so I think that there are many rabbis, and I in all strains of Judaism, who try to be lenient on this question of an abortion, who try to, right, because even our texts that are here, we will look at some other ones that will answer this question of sort of, are there any limits? How do you decide? What do you do? there are some limits that the rabbis do think of, but I think in general, Judaism is very supportive of the right to abortion. Some people will just say only if the life of the mother is at stake, right? That is the thing that is the caveat that some people will put on it, right? That Judaism views the fetus as potential life. And so when you have potential life versus alive people, the alive people always win, which is the mother, right? But and so people will say when the life of the mother is at stake. And different people, as we know, have different ideas of what it means for the life of the mother to be at stake, right? Do you have to be actively dying? Are there, can you take mental health? Can you take your financial situation into account? And different rabbis come down in different places on that question. But I can't say this with complete certainty because I'm sure there's someone out there somewhere, but I would say almost all rabbis in almost all cases would say that if the life of the fetus threatens the life of the mother, then an abortion is permitted and possibly required. In general, not even the mother can choose the fetus's life over her own life. And so often there are cases where people will say, not only is an abortion permitted, but it is required because the life that you save is the life of the mothers, which we're going to see in just a second. Okay, so Evan asked, is the violate Shabbat in order to save the fetus so he can observe many more Shabbats used to justify saving the fetus for other reasons of potential? So this thing about saving a life so you can celebrate more Shabbats is in general what the rabbis say about why you can violate Shabbat to save any life, not just the life of a fetus, right? So in traditional Judaism, you cannot put out a fire on Shabbat. But if your house is burning down and there's people inside of it, you can put out a fire on Shabbat so that people don't die, right? The idea is that you violate one Shabbat to allow people to celebrate many more Shabbats, which is I think, very beautiful way of saying, like, in this case, the ends justify the means. In this case, you can violate Shabbat so that people will have the chance to celebrate Shabbat in the future. I think there are probably ways that you could, use this for evil instead of for good when talking about abortion. But in general, this is one of those things where people say, like, where this is really more about should you intervene in the case of a miscarriage that's happening on Shabbat, or what kind of monitoring or what kind of interventions can people have on Shabbat? I think Robert is asking a question, but I don't have the full question. So I'm gonna go back to sharing, and then I'll try to answer some more questions as they come up. But thank you all for your questions. I enjoy the questions. So this is probably one of the most famous, it depends, I guess, what circles you're in. One of the most famous Mishnahs about abortion, which says, if a woman is having trouble giving birth, they cut up the child in her womb and bring it forth limb by limb, because her life comes before the life of the child. So we'll read the second sentence in a minute, right? There is a lot of chatter in very extreme circumstances about, like, people who want to abort completely healthy babies while they're being born, right? Which in general is ridiculous. But what is being talked about here, I think, is they are giving us the most extreme possible example. This is a baby who is in the process of being born, and you save the life of the mother. If it comes down to life of mother versus life of child, it's life of mother. There's really no wiggle room here. You save the life of the mother because she is a life and her fetus baby is a potential life. But if the greater part of the baby has come out, one may not touch it, for one may not set aside one person's life for that of another. So if the baby is most of the, 51% of the way out, then you have to let nature take its course, because you can't decide we, not being God, we being fallible human beings and people who believe in the ultimate sanctity of life, we are not allowed to decide who we are not allowed to decide who lives and who dies in this moment, right? That is only for God. And so until the moment when the baby becomes a life, right? When it's most of the, 51% of the way out, you save the life of the mother, but after that, you try to save both, but if you can only save one at that point, you save the one most likely to be saved, right? That's how you approach this. And so this is a Rashi. Rashi is one of our most famous commentators. He is commenting also on this question of abortion. Well, they don't call it that, but on what to do here with a woman that is experiencing difficulty giving birth and is in mortal danger, right? The woman is going to die. And it is taught in the first section of this teaching, the midwife extends her hands and cuts it up and extracts the pieces. As the entire time that it has not gone out into the air of the world, it is not considered a soul. And so it is possible to kill it and save the mother, right? Rashi is saying basically the same thing. But I think the way Rashi is saying it, right, this idea that what makes you a human, what makes you a life is like being out in the world. What makes you a life is having contact with the outside world outside of your mother's womb. But when its head came out, we cannot touch it to kill it, as it is like a born baby, and we do not push off one soul for the sake of the other, right? So he has a little bit different. He says when the head is out, but the top one says when 50% is out. But in general, you can see this idea that basically a baby is not considered a life until it is born by somebody's definition, right? It has to actually be born. And if the baby is putting the mother's, if the birth is putting the mother's life in danger, then you have to save the mother, right? That is the requirement. And that's part of what makes these discussions about abortion so scary, is that it's not only women whose lives are in danger at the moment that they're giving birth, right? But there are many other moments in pregnancy for anyone who's ever been pregnant, right, that have a lot of potential to be very, very dangerous. And what the rabbis are saying is sort of no matter what stage your fetus is in, until it is born, it is the life of the mother. And I will just say that the United States has one of the highest, if not the highest, maternal mortality rate in the developed world, right? And we are not doing a good job saving the life of the mother. We want to save everybody's life, and if people want to have babies, I want the babies to live, I want the mothers to live, I want everybody to be alive and happy, right? But we are not doing a good job taking care of women and people who are pregnant in this country, and Judaism would be ashamed of us for that, because what Judaism wants is for us to take care of the life that is in front of us, and not worry as much about the potential life, right? First we worry about the life in front of us, then we worry about the potential life. That's not to say like don't try to save the baby. Of course you try to save the baby, but if you can't, Judaism is clear on what the value proposition is. And I know that these can be sort of difficult for people to hear, and I invite you to put they don't have to be questions. They can also be reactions or thoughts, or like, I can't believe Judaism says this, or I love that Judaism says this. I think all of that I would love to see in the text. Is there a consensus in the circumstances around which a woman can have an abortion in the Orthodox world? I believe the consensus is that if the doctor says that this pregnancy will kill you, for sure, everyone agrees that women can have abortions. It gets murkier around the questions of like what is considered to be life threatening to the mother. But I will tell you that when the draft decision was leaked, a number of my friends who are Orthodox rabbis, my friends tend to be on the more left-wing side of being Orthodox rabbis, posted comments about various kinds of counsel that they have had to give to women seeking abortion. And I would say almost all of them consider sort of mental health and physical health and financial health to be to be part of the conversation about what it means to endanger the life of the mother, right? You don't have to be like bleeding out on the floor for people to feel like that justifies an abortion. Yes, there's a lot of, one of the arguments that Jews, especially led by the National Council for Jewish Women, are making is that completely restricting abortion is a violation of Jews' religious freedom, because there are situations in which almost everyone would agree that that abortion is required. And so there is, right, that is, to my mind, that's actually a relatively, within the last 5 years, kind of line of thinking, this question of, does a ban on abortion violate Jews' religious freedom? I would say, you know, my reading of it is yes. I'm neither a legal scholar nor an expert in these things, but my reading of it, and I think it's a fairly persuasive argument, this idea that these texts, which are sacred to us and which inform so much of how we live our lives, if we are told abortion is illegal under all circumstances, we would not be able to live in accordance with our sacred texts. Yes, I think the examples that we're looking at about, you know, an abortion for a baby who is like on the way out into the world is an extreme example. Like, they don't really have safe C-sections at the time that these texts are being written. And even if they do have something, they know about C-sections for sure. They discuss them, but they're not very safe, right? Because of infection and it's surgery, and they're not very safe. And so, yes. And so it is, right? I think, Judaism would say, if you can save the baby and the mother by doing a C-section, that's obviously preferable to killing the baby to save the mother. But we do know that there are situations where, for various reasons, both parties cannot be saved. And Judaism, I think, is trying to give us a way forward. But in the modern era, I would say this kind of situation, thank God, is exceptionally rare in places that have modern medicine. So yeah, so Susan said, you know, an ectopic pregnancy, right, which is not even a potential life, it'll just kill you. So right, that kind of thing where you have to have some kind of surgery because it will literally kill you, and it definitely cannot become a life, right, is one of the examples that people are talking about around this draft opinion, and why it might be problematic beyond just like abortion as we understand it. Okay, I'm gonna push us ahead a little bit. Yeah, we're gonna look at I just noticed that my texts have numbers. We're gonna look at the one labeled number 9, which is from the Mishnah Torah, which is Rambam. He wrote an extensive legal code called the Mishnah Torah, and he is talking now about the category of a rodef. If you ever went on the West Side and you went to Congregation Rodef Shalom, right, that means like a pursuer of justice, of peace, Rodef Shalom. But rodef is actually like it is a negative term in most situations, because it is a person who is pursuing you to do you harm. So if someone is coming to rob your house, they are a rodef, and you are permitted to defend yourself against them. So if someone's coming to rob your house and you kill them, that is permitted because they are pursuing you for harm. So they're going to talk. So that's the context that Rambam is talking about. So he says, This indeed is one of the negative mitzvot, not to negative commandments, not to take pity on the life of a rodef, right? If someone is coming to kill you, don't hesitate to kill them, right? You are allowed to preserve your own life. On this basis, our sages ruled that when complications arise and a pregnant woman cannot give birth, it is permitted to abort the fetus in her womb, whether with a knife or with drugs, right? That surgically or with drugs. For the fetus is considered a rodef of the mother, right? The fetus is the thing putting the mother's life in danger. And so you are permitted to kill the thing that is putting your life in danger. If the head of the fetus emerges, it should not be touched because one life should not be sacrificed for another. Although the mother may die, this is the nature of the world, right? So as long as the fetus is in the womb, if it is somehow threatening the life of the mother, an abortion is, I would say, permitted to required in that case. And notice also that they do have a concept of a medication abortion, which is another discussion, which I don't think we're gonna have time for, right? They're not only talking about surgical abortion, but they have a concept of medication abortion, which is interesting, and there's a lot of interesting pieces written about that. Right, so the rabbis have this true understanding that pregnancy is quite dangerous, and that when you are pregnant, it's not all like, you know, glowing loveliness where you can put your feet up. There are times when the fetus is threatening the mother, and people use this text to talk about, like, what does it mean that the fetus is a rodef of the mother, right? What does it mean that the fetus is threatening the mother in some way? And then they use that to really expand the question of when is it permitted to get an abortion. So Jane asked this question, which we're going to answer in just a minute. What does Judaism say about a woman who wants an abortion because of financial concerns or any other concern, right? There are women, I think something like 70% of people who get abortions in the United States are already mothers, right? There are reasons, and there are reasons that people get abortions that have nothing to do with any of this, right? People also who have a miscarriage have to get an abortion to get rid of it, right? There's no more potential life, but they have to get what is technically an abortion in order to get rid of the pregnancy. A lot, right? We are, and I heard this unbelievable statistic. This morning or yesterday on a podcast where they were talking about this idea, right, that a woman who gets an abortion is significantly more likely to go on and have a child in her future than a woman who is not permitted to have an abortion, right? That being forced to carry a pregnancy to term, even if someone then gives up the baby for adoption or doesn't raise the baby for some reason, actually leads to people not wanting to have any more children, right? So if the goal is for people to have children, and, you know, as Judaism would say, be fruitful and multiply, then this statistic would tell us that people, in fact, should be allowed to have abortions when they need them. Okay, so if the mother wants to spare the fetus at the expense of her life, would she be considered suicidal? I don't know if that would be considered exactly suicidal, but Judaism basically says no, you can't, right? You cannot say to the doctor, like, let me die and save my baby. Although I think, you know, we all have probably imagined situations in which people would say that. But Judaism is clear that the fetus is a potential life and the mother is an actual life, and we should save her until the baby is part way out. And after that, it's like, let nature take its course. All right, so we're going to answer a little bit Jane's question with the next two responsa, which are, I call them more modern. It's from 1913, but it is more modern when you compare it to the Talmud. Mental health risk has been definitely equated with physical health risk. This woman in danger of losing her mental health unless the pregnancy is interrupted would therefore accordingly qualify. So this is somebody has asked the Choshen Mishpat, that's his name is Rabbi Mordechai Winkler, but he is known as the Choshen Mishpat, which is his primary work. We like to name people after their books. So he comes, somebody asks him a question to say, like, can you have an abortion because of a mental health risk and not only because of a physical health risk? And he says, yes, right? That people's mental health is also extremely important, right? People, and so that should be taken into consideration under the question of whether people should be allowed to have an abortion. And then you get this responsa from Rabbi Ben Zion Chai Uziel, who says it is clear that an abortion is not permitted without reason, right? You can't just like wake up in the morning and say like, I want to have an abortion and go get one. Nobody does that, so it's fine. That would be destructive and frustrative of the possibility of life, right? We value the possibility of life. We just don't value it over an actual life that's right in front of us. But for a reason, even a slim reason, such as to prevent disgrace, then we have precedent and authority to permit it. So this question of, right, if having another child means that you will not be able to pay for that child or the child you already have, or you will end up homeless, or you will end up out of a job, or you will not be able to feed said children, right? Our society is very interested in fetuses and not that interested in children who are alive. And so we have no structures to prevent these things from happening. And if you have a reason to think that having another child would put you out on the street in some way, or even would make your life significantly more difficult, right? If you are in a relationship with somebody who is abusive to you, and having a child would add to that, or would create more challenges in your life, right? He says we have precedent and authority to permit it. That doesn't mean every rabbi you go and ask is going to say yes. He's just saying it is the legal texts are there if you want them, right? There is a famous Orthodox feminist named Blue Greenberg who says, when there is a rabbinic will, there is a halachic way, right? Which means that if the rabbis want to permit it, then they will find a way to tell you that the text permits it. And I think that's a little bit what he is saying here, which is, if a woman comes to you in deep distress and wants to have an abortion, you should find a way to make it permissible for her to have one, right? And in some ways, this is, if you read it like that, which I would like to, we have never spoken, so I can't say if this is what he means, but I think if you read it like that, right, then what you're saying is a woman who wants to get an abortion still works within the system, but the system wants to empower her to know her own body and her own mind and her own life, and to find a way for her to have an abortion within the system that she values, right? Because if you go to your rabbi and it's hard if you are a Reform Jew or even a conservative Jew to imagine living in a world where if you go to your rabbi and the rabbi says, no, you're not going to do it. I mean, I know all of you would never go against what Rabbi Bachtal tells you to do, but in general, right, in the world that he is living in, if you go to your rabbi and your rabbi says, no, you really shouldn't do it. And so what he's saying is, if there's a small reason that she wants to have an abortion, you should listen to her and try to find a way. So I'm going to look at, oh, the timing is so good. This almost never happens to me. We're going to look at two more pieces, and then we can take any sort of like last questions or closing comments. This is the Tzitz Eliezer. Again, we name people after their books. If there is a danger to the mother from continuing the pregnancy, one should permit abortion without hesitation, right? So don't even go ask your rabbi. If your doctor says you are in danger, have an abortion. Do that, do the thing, right? If there's some reason, look, if you are in an abusive relationship and having a baby would put you in and your baby in danger, have an abortion, says the Tzitz Eliezer. Also, if her health is poor and to cure her or relieve her from great pain, it is necessary to abort the fetus. Even if she is not in actual danger, there is room to permit it, right? So if having a baby wouldn't kill you, but it would create a lot of problems to your health, to your well-being, to your body, if for some reason and that is the reason you want to have an abortion. Your life is not in danger, but what he says, I think we should permit it. There's room to permit it. Well, we can find ways to permit it because we want to be lenient when the actual person standing in front of you is telling you that they are suffering. And although it doesn't work all of the time in Judaism, I want to think about Judaism as being a religion that values compassion. And so when a woman is standing in front of you and saying to you, I need to get an abortion because my mental health is at stake, because my financial health and my future is at stake, because I'm in a terrible relationship, because I cannot have another child right now, or for whatever other reason that is generally none of my business unless someone wants to share it with me, we should find a way to make them feel like they're not going outside the realm of Judaism. They're not violating their religion that they love and trust, and are able to do it within that framework. And by the way, there's plenty of reasons to permit abortion that have nothing to do with Judaism, but if it feels important to this person who wants to have an abortion to do it within a Jewish frame, then I want to find a way to make that happen, because I do not want Judaism to bring misery into people's lives. And as a final note, I bring this paragraph from a longer article in the Jewish Women's Archive, right? That says, in the last half of the 20th century, women's voices still remain absent in the halachic, in the legal discussion on abortion. Those rabbis who preach the most stringent positions do not carry the pregnancies with all the physical stress and danger, bear unwanted, or defective is a terrible word here, but children, or bear the major burdens of caring for them. Their stringencies, couched in moralistic terms, are played out on women's bodies, right? And so what she is reminding us here is the voice of who is missing, which is the people who carry the child. Their voices are not included in these conversations. And so while I have brought you texts that show you that abortion is permitted and sometimes required in the Jewish tradition, I would also say that if women were the ones originally responding to that text from Exodus and to the text from the Torah, you might get a very different approach, which may look something like women should be able to do with their own bodies what they want, just like men, right? You may get a completely different approach. Here you have people who do not carry pregnancies making decisions for people who do. And I would say that is something that we as a country and we as a Jewish people could certainly work on. So I would say, if you want to learn more about this topic, I'm very, very happy to talk to you about it more. I also would say National Council for Jewish Women is a fantastic resource on this topic. Rabbi Danya Ruttenberg, if you're on Twitter, she's someone you should definitely follow. But she is like a real expert on this topic, and someone who I believe is like a real halachic and moral authority for our time. And so I thank you all for being here. I'm sorry we couldn't discuss it more, but hopefully one day we will all get to have a nice coffee and discuss it together. So thank you all so much for being here. I don't know if Rabbi Berman or Rachel have any closing words they want to add.
I just want to echo the words that are flowing through the chat box. Rabbi Rosenthal, you are an incredible teacher, and thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and our wisdom with us. So thank you so much. And thank you to everybody for being here. And thank you to Rachel for making this happen. Have a good night, everybody.
Good night, everyone. Thanks for being here.